All right, so today we're doing a deep dive on the Black Death. But get this, we're going way beyond the usual rats and fleas narrative. You've given us some really fascinating sources, so buckle up, listeners. We're about to uncover some surprising truths about a pandemic so devastating it wiped out a huge part of Europe's population and left its mark on, well, pretty much everything.
It's true. The Black Death wasn't just a medieval pandemic. Its echoes are still felt today in everything from art and literature to our understanding of disease and even globalization.
It really makes you think, right? Like, where did this thing even come from? Everyone always says Asia, but the research you've provided suggests a much more, shall we say, nuanced origin story.
You're right to question the simple answer. While Central Asia is often pointed to as the starting point, pinpointing the exact location is a lot more complicated. In fact, some historians even propose it might have originated in Europe. We're talking about a historical puzzle with pieces scattered across continents.
A history puzzle. I like it. So how do we even begin to solve it?
Well, one major clue we have is the Silk Road, that ancient network connecting East and West. It wasn't just silk and spices traveling those routes. It seems a very unwelcome passenger was also hitching a ride. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes the plague.
Hold on. The Silk Road, a disease vector.
Yes.
Suddenly, those bustling trade routes seem a lot less romantic and a lot more, well, dangerous.
It definitely adds a new dimension to how we view globalization even back then. And speaking of globalization, get this, there's evidence from Nestorian Christian grave sites near Lake Issyk-Kul, dating back to the 1330s, which mention a pestilence.
Wait, the 1330s? That's decades before the Black Death ravaged Europe. Are we talking about the plague? Even earlier than we thought.
It's definitely a possibility. These inscriptions, along with evidence of Yersinia pestis in archaeological digs along those same trade routes, really make you think. It challenges the traditional timeline of the Black Death and suggests its reach was even wider, more ancient than we originally thought.
Okay, my mind is already blown, and we haven't even gotten to the rats yet. Speaking of which, you know the whole rat-flea connection. Well, the research you provided suggests that transmission might have been a lot more complex than that.
You're spot on. While fleas on rats were a huge factor, it doesn't explain the whole picture. For example, the speed at which the Black Death spread, even during winter when fleas were less active. Well, it suggests something else was going on.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What else could have contributed to this rapid spread?
There is strong evidence that the pneumonic plague, a particularly nasty form that infects the lungs, could be transmitted person to person through the air. Now imagine this. Crowded medieval cities, limited sanitation.
The perfect breeding ground for airborne illness. So it wasn't just about getting bitten by a flea. Breathing the same air as an infected person could also be a death sentence. Makes those packed medieval streets seem even more terrifying.
Right, and here's where it gets even more interesting. Some scholars believe that what we call the Black Death might actually have been multiple pandemics happening at the same time.
Hold on, multiple pandemics at once. That's terrifying. But it would explain how it became so widespread, so devastating. What other clues point to this theory?
Well, for starters, the plague's severity and the patterns of transmission, they don't neatly align with what we know about modern Yersinia pestis outbreaks. It suggests that other pathogens, other diseases could have contributed to the overall chaos, making it much harder to contain.
So a perfect storm of disease and human behavior with absolutely catastrophic result.
Exactly. And to fully grasp the human cost of this pandemic, we have to delve into the lives of those who lived through it.
Well, you gave us a particularly chilling account from an Italian writer who experienced it firsthand, Boccaccio. I have to say, his descriptions of the Black Death in Florence are both fascinating and absolutely terrifying.
Boccaccio offers an invaluable first-hand look at the terror and the despair. He describes the city in chaos, bodies piling up in the streets faster than they could bury them.
It's hard to even imagine that scale of death. But it wasn't just the number of people dying, was it? The Black Death was known for its particularly gruesome symptoms, too. Tell me more about that.
Oh, absolutely. The Black Death wasn't just about dying. It was about the horrifying way in which it took people. Imagine, if you will, these painful, swollen lymph nodes called buboes erupting on the body, sometimes growing as large as apples.
Okay. I'm getting chills just thinking about it. And those are just the external symptoms, right?
Right. Internally, the plague was wreaking havoc, causing fever, chills, vomiting, and excruciating pain. And death often came quickly, sometimes within days of the first symptoms.
It's no wonder people were terrified. This wasn't just a cough or a fever. This was a brutal, swift attack on the human body. Did they even have any idea how to treat it?
They tried, they really did, but with such a limited understanding of disease, their methods were often ineffective, even horrifying in some cases.
Oh, yeah. I've heard about some of those so-called cures. Medieval medicine was not for the faint of heart, from what I remember.
That's putting it lightly. Bloodletting, for instance, was a popular choice, though it probably did more harm than good. Then there were the attempts to purify the air using strong smells, like vinegar or flowers. They believed the plague was spread by bad air.
Not exactly scientific. And what about those stories I've heard of people rubbing crushed sapphires on their buboes? Sounds like something straight out of a dark fairy tale.
Desperate times, desperate measures, right? The truth is, without any real understanding of the plague's cause or how it spread, people were grasping at straws, willing to try anything to survive. Which brings us to one of the most enduring images of the Black Death.
The plague doctors.
Oh yes, the plague doctors. You have to admit, those bird-masked figures, there's something both terrifying and fascinating about them, like something straight out of a horror movie.
They've definitely become an iconic symbol of the era, haven't they? But it's important to remember those outfits, as creepy as they seem now, represented the cutting edge of medical technology at the time.
Wait, really? Explain that one to me.
Well, those long, beak-like masks weren't just for show. They were filled with aromatic herbs and spices, which, according to the medical understanding of the time, would purify the air and protect them from the bad air that supposedly carried the plague. So like medieval hazmat suits.
Exactly. It might seem strange to us now, but those plague doctors were on the front lines of a terrifying pandemic. They were risking their lives to try and save others using the best knowledge that they had.
It makes you wonder what future generations will think about our methods of fighting illness. What will they see as our version of the plague doctor's mask?
That is a fascinating question. But for now, let's shift gears and delve into the Black Death's impact on society, because it wasn't just about death and disease, was it? It completely upended the world as they knew it.
And that's where things get really interesting. Because alongside the devastation, there were glimmers of resilience, of change that would echo through history.
It's easy to focus on the darkness of the Black Death, and for good reason. But like you said, there were these ripples of change alongside the death. What doesn't kill you
makes you stronger. I don't know if I'd call the Black Death a character-building experience, but I see what you mean. One of the most interesting outcomes of all this death was how it impacted social structures.
Absolutely. With a much smaller population, the need for workers, for laborers, it just exploded. So for those who survived, particularly the lower classes, well, they suddenly had a lot more bargaining power.
So this horrible tragedy, almost by accident, created new opportunities.
Exactly. Landowners needed people to work their land, to pay rent. Feudalism, this system that had been around for centuries, it started to crumble. It wasn't just about surviving a disease. It was about the very fabric of society being reshaped.
Okay, hold on. Quick recap for those of us who haven't looked at a history book in a while. Feudalism, in a nutshell.
Feudalism was a rigid social system. Peasants were tied to the land, working for lords in exchange for protection. But the Black Death, it threw that all out of whack. Fewer peasants to exploit meant the lords lost a lot of their power.
That makes sense. And I imagine such a massive power shift impacted how people saw the world, too.
You're right on the money. The Black Death wasn't just a physical plague. It was a plague of faith, of certainty. Imagine seeing your loved ones die, your entire community falling apart. Of course, people began to question everything they thought they knew about God, about the world.
And with no internet to turn to, the anxiety must have been off the charts. How did they deal with all this existential dread?
Some found comfort in religion, but they took it to another level, like the flagellants, for example.
Flagellants, okay, refresh my memory.
They believed that God was punishing them for their sins, so they would whip themselves publicly as a form of penance.
Intense. I get wanting forgiveness, but self-flagellation seems a bit much.
It really shows you the level of fear and desperation, and unfortunately, a lot of that fear turned into something much darker, scapegoating.
It's like the Jewish communities across Europe, blaming an entire group of people for something they have no control over. A story as old as time, unfortunately.
It's tragic. Accusations of poisoning wells, spreading the plague intentionally, it was all nonsense, of course, but it led to violence, massacres, a chilling reminder of how quickly fear becomes prejudice and brutality.
It's like pandemics, as if the disease itself wasn't bad enough, bring out the best and worst in humanity.
You're right, it's not always so simple. Amidst all that horror, there were amazing acts of courage and compassion, too. King Casimir III of Poland, for example, he offered sanctuary to Jews who were being persecuted in other parts of Europe.
It's stories like that that give me hope, Even in the darkest times, human kindness finds a way. But on a more practical level, how did the Black Death actually end? Did it just go away?
The initial outbreak, yes, it did eventually subside, but not because of a cure or anything like that. Like a lot of pandemics, it just ran its course. But that doesn't mean the plague vanished completely. It would actually pop up again and again over the next several centuries.
So it became this recurring nightmare, a shadow hanging over Europe even after that first devastating wave.
In a way, yes. The Black Death changed everything, not just the lives lost, but how people lived, how they thought, how they interacted. Its impact was profound and long-lasting.
And one of the most significant changes to come out of this, I think, was something we totally take for granted today. Quarantine.
You're absolutely right. The word quarantine comes from this period, from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. That was how long ships suspected of carrying the plague were isolated before anyone could get off.
So they created a system to isolate potential carriers to prevent the spread. Talk about a game changer. Out of this massive tragedy came some really important developments in public health.
Exactly. The Black Death forced humanity to adapt. And those early quarantine measures, as basic as they might seem now, were a crucial step in the fight against contagious disease. But the impact of the Black Death, it went far beyond just public health. It had a huge impact on the arts, too.
You mean how artists of the time incorporated all this death and decay into their work? Considering what they were witnessing, it makes sense.
Right. Think of the danse macabre. This artistic motif popped up after the Black Death, and it shows skeletons dancing with the living. It's this chilling but powerful reminder of death.
Like they were trying to process this immense collective trauma through art, to express something that words just couldn't capture.
Exactly. And the danse macabre, as morbid as it might seem now, reflects how people saw death, how they saw the afterlife. Art became a way to express their deepest fears.
It's a fascinating paradox, right? This plague, all this death and suffering, and yet it also sparks this wave of creativity and introspection.
Absolutely. And that wave of change went beyond the art world, too. Some argue that the Black Death, by shaking things up socially, politically, even religiously, helped pave the way for the Renaissance.
Now, that's a bold statement. Are we really saying that the Black Death, this horrible pandemic, helped bring about the Renaissance?
It might sound counterintuitive, but it has a certain logic. With fewer people and the old social order in question, well, there was more room for individuals to move up in the world, the demand for skilled labor grew, and with it, social mobility and a questioning of the old hierarchy.
So tragedy, even on this scale, can lead to new ideas, new ways of thinking.
Exactly. The Black Death was a horrific chapter in human history, no doubt, but it was also a turning point, and its effects are still felt today.
It really is. It's like this one event, this Black Death, had such a massive impact, not just on how people live day to day, but on their whole worldview, even centuries later. It's pretty mind-blowing.
It shows how history isn't just this straight line, It's more like everything's connected, cause and effect. The Black Death forced people to think about their own mortality, and that got them thinking about philosophy, religion, all that big stuff.
And from all that suffering, we see the seeds of the Renaissance. Art, science, intellectual exploration, all that amazing stuff. It's like humanity's response to this massive trauma was to embrace life, embrace knowledge, but in a totally new way. Kind of a phoenix rising from the ashes thing, I guess.
That's a good way to put it. The church had always had this monopoly on knowledge, right? Telling people what to think, how to see the world. But the Black Death, it weakened their authority. People started asking questions, looking for other explanations.
So that questioning spirit, that hunger for knowledge, it fueled the Renaissance. Wow. That's wild when you really think about it.
It really is. The resilience of the human spirit, I guess you'd call it. Even after unimaginable loss and suffering, we still want to create, to explore, to understand. It's pretty incredible, actually.
It makes you think, though. What can we learn from all this? We think we're so advanced now with our technology, modern medicine, and then something like COVID-19 comes along.
Yeah.
It's like we're right back in the Middle Ages, facing this invisible enemy.
It's true. It reminds us that even with all our progress, we're not invincible. Nature finds a way, right? The Black Death, as awful as it was, it holds these important lessons about how societies deal with pandemics, the social and cultural changes that happen, the impact that's felt for generations. We can learn from that.
We have to learn from the past, right? Like those early quarantines, they were basic, but still, it shows that even in the middle of all that chaos, people were trying to figure out how to slow the spread, how to protect themselves and each other.
Absolutely. Pandemics, they're not just about biology and disease. They're social, cultural events. How we respond, the choices we make, the stories we tell, it all becomes part of history. The Black Death teaches us that.
So the big question is, what can we take away from all this? What do we learn from the Black Death can help us navigate the challenges we face today?
You know, I think the Black Death ultimately reminds us that we're all connected. We might have our differences, but we face these shared threats, these global challenges, and the only way to overcome them is through empathy, cooperation, and learning from what's come before.
Well said. It's a bit of a heavy thought, but there's hope in there too. Even facing something as devastating as the Black Death, humanity finds a way. We adapt, we innovate, we figure out a way forward.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe centuries from now, people will look back at our time, at the challenges we faced, and they'll see how we too not only survived, but found ways to thrive.
That's a great note to end on. A huge thank you to you and everyone listening for joining us on this deep dive into the Black Death. It's been quite a journey, a stark reminder of both the fragility and the incredible resilience of humanity.